Welcome everyone to today's Irish Landscape Institute webinar. I'm delighted to welcome Pádraic Fogarty as today's speaker. Pádraic is very well known, I think, to most of us, and he just give you some details on some of his work. So, um, Pádraic is an ecologist and former campaign officer for the Irish Wildlife Trust. He is author of the 2017 book Whittled Away, Ireland's Vanishing Nature, and he hosted the 2021 podcast series Shaping New Mountains and is a contributor to the Irish Times, British Wildlife Examiner, and Journal.ie. And Pádraic's talk today is entitled Rewilding and the Ecological Emergency. So I'm delighted now to hand you over to Pádraic.
Thanks very much, Mark. Thank you, Hazel, and thank you for the invitation to talk to you today. I'll just get this going. Oh yeah, there we go. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about rewilding and the ecological emergency, which is quite broad, really. And Mark, you'll keep an eye on the time, so hopefully we'll have time for questions at the end.
Yeah, so if anyone just wants to pop their questions into the chat, then I'll put them to you at the end, Pádraic, so you can talk away without interruption.
That's fine, yeah, no problem. So, oftentimes when we start talking about our ecological problems, we're kind of hamstrung by our language even. We talk about the climate emergency, we talk about the biodiversity emergency, but rarely does our language really capture the full range of environmental pressures that we're experiencing at the moment. So some of you may be familiar with this idea of the planetary boundaries. It was devised principally, I think the main instigator was a chap called Johan Rockström, who has become a very prominent climate scientist in recent years, and he has some excellent work on TED and YouTube that I'd recommend. But they basically looked at this way of conceptualizing our environmental issues through the planetary boundaries, and these were really designed to describe the what if you can see in the center there's a safe operating space. So we're talking about humanity here. We're talking about human civilization and the very comfortable window in which human civilization has evolved, particularly over the last 5 or 6 thousand years. And you can see they've divided this up, and we've got 9 planetary boundaries. And some of these issues might be familiar with you. We talk about climate change. We talk about biosphere integrity. There would be equivalent to biodiversity, what we talk about. Things like ocean acidification relates to the amount of carbon dioxide that has gone into the atmosphere and which has since been reabsorbed into the ocean, where carbon dioxide dissolves actually very easily in water, and it creates a mildly acidic solution. So the ocean is acidifying. We also see things like land system change. This would be principally the conversion of forests to agriculture, or the drainage of wetlands, the use of freshwater abstraction in particular, biogeochemical flows. At the end, for any chemists in the audience, you'll see there's a little P and an N. That stands for phosphorus and nitrogen. They're key nutrients in the life cycle of ecosystems and organisms. And what we've done is we've basically disrupted the natural cycles of P and N, mostly through burning of fossil fuels, as well as the creation of artificial fertilizers, which have largely ended up in our waterways. One interesting one at the top there that, possibly doesn't get enough discussion is novel entities. This is the proliferation of chemical compounds into the environment that basically didn't exist, more or less prior to the Second World War. And we're talking about everything from microplastics now, which are in our brains and our organs, and glyphosate, and all the many different pharmaceuticals and cleaning agents and all kinds of things that have absolutely exploded in number. And you'll see they're all interrelated as well. It's very difficult to talk about one of these without seeing the interconnections with the others. And you'll also notice the rather scary assessment by Johan and his team that 6 planetary boundaries have already been crossed, uh, meaning that if we want to stay within a safe operating space for humanity and our civilizations, we really need to get those parameters back into back within the boundaries of the safe space. Now, the other important aspect to this is that when we talk about human development is obviously very uneven. And there are rich people and there are poor people. And while many of us, appreciate that we have an ecological footprint that is not compatible with having a safe planet, we also have to recognize that there are very many people on the planet that do not consume enough, that whose lifestyles do not meet basic human needs. And I'm thinking about issues like hunger, sanitation, housing, education, all of these things. We still live in an extremely unequal world. So there was an effort to marry these two ideas of the planetary boundaries with these social thresholds into what is known as donut economics. This was an idea from a English economist. Her name is Kate Raworth, and she wrote a book called Donut Economics, and it's an excellent read. And basically, the idea is that we reduce our ecological footprint while also increasing the welfare of people, so that we're all living in this perfect donut. And you see on the left-hand side this team, which involves Kate Raworth in the University of Leeds in the UK, to look at where countries are in terms of meeting social needs and exceeding planetary boundaries. And you'll see there's quite a divide between countries. I put the circle there around Ireland. So basically, rich countries are living beyond the environmental means of the planet, while there's a lot of poor countries down there in the bottom on the left that are basically not contributing to the planetary crisis, but have very significant social issues. And this was wrapped up in the idea of the Sustainable Development Goals, where it wasn't just about poor countries getting rich to the way we are now, because if that happened, it would be completely impossible in terms of planetary boundaries. And so there's a lot of work to do, not only for the poorest to develop their economies to provide for their people, but there's also a lot of work to be done by the rich countries that are basically taking more than our fair share of the planet's resources. So broadly speaking, though, I'm going to spend the rest of my talk talking about climate and biodiversity, which are really the two main pillars of our environmental issues, notwithstanding the other issues that I've mentioned. And this, of course, is our main problem at the moment. It's that global CO2 concentrations have basically been following an exponential trend since the Industrial Revolution. And that this is the most recent data I can get. I think the latest data point there is 2023. You can see, I mean, there might be a little inflection. There is some talk about reaching peak emissions, but I mean, honestly, it doesn't look like it, does it? I mean, it's, for everything that's happening, we're still increasing greenhouse gas emissions at an enormous rate. This is just zooming in. And I went on to the website of NOAA, which is a US scientific body, and they are monitoring CO2 levels in Hawaii. And you can see the pattern there. The little waves on it represent the annual fluctuations in CO2 between the northern summer and the northern winter, when in the northern summer you have a lot of vegetation that's using carbon dioxide, and so it dips. But the average you can see is steadily upwards, so that today we're at 426 parts per million. And of course, the problem with that is that it is precipitating changes to the global average surface temperature, which you can see here, which is lagging a bit, and it's not yet following the exponential trend that we see with the greenhouse, with the carbon dioxide emissions. But who knows where we're headed with this? But that is basically the problem: is that carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases trap heat in the atmosphere and result in this warming effect. And this is the kind of results that we're seeing these days. These headlines I'm showing you now are just from the last 6 months. The effects of climate change, I think, are happening a lot faster than scientists predicted. And I think in many ways, the predictions of scientists over the years have been particularly cautious, particularly reserved in their judgments. And what's happening is we're now getting a level of warming that is leaving scientists scratching their heads. And that's obviously not a happy place for us to be in. And this is a kind of the effects that we're likely to see. And this is two scenarios. This modeling is available online. You can zoom into where you live and see what the effect of sea level rise is going to be. So this is just one aspect of a warming world. And you can see Dublin under 2 degrees of warming on the right-hand side sees an awful lot of the eastern portion of the city inundated. 2 degrees, by the way, is, more or less the target of Paris Agreement. They did say 1.5 was their kind of their main headline goal, but it was like 1.5 if we can, but definitely not more than 2. 1.5, I think, is increasingly seen as a fantastical goal that is, virtually impossible to be reached. 2 degrees, you can see, is not a good place to be, and this is just sea level rise. It doesn't account for the other effects of climate change, the extreme weather, etc. 4 degrees on the left-hand side, you can see that much of our infrastructure for Dublin City is goosed. Now, I'm coming back now to the inequalities in climate emissions, and this just shows again the kind of distribution we have in per capita emissions. And Ireland, for instance, this data is from 2023. Ireland, per person in Ireland, we're emitting, or in 2023, we're emitting 6.6 tons of CO2 emissions. And that figure has actually come down in recent years. But to put that in context, France has a per capita emission of about 4.1. So we're about a quarter to a third higher than France. The USA has 14.3 tons per person, which is gargantuan. And if you're from Ethiopia, the likelihood is that you are emitting 0.1 ton of greenhouse gases. So the inequalities here are stark. Now, interestingly, over time, this graph has changed a lot because countries like China and India have seriously caught up. A lot of the countries in the Middle East and so on are emitting a lot more greenhouse gases than they used to be. So that inequality gap is narrowing in some places, but not in a good way. Now, I'm going to take it back to Ireland. And this is data. Again, it's the most recent available. I thought they might have data for 24, but it wasn't on their website. But for 23, this is where our greenhouse gas emissions are coming from. And you can see most of it is to do with agriculture and our farming system. Also, we see our energy, and there's good news on our energy because we are generating more and more renewable energy through wind and solar. And we hope, of course, that offshore wind will significantly decarbonize our electricity system. But you can see transport there is a big problem. Transport emissions are going up. And the last assessment, agriculture came down a little bit. And overall, greenhouse gas emissions are coming down in Ireland, but it's early days. And agriculture is still it's really the monster in the room when we talk about greenhouse gases. And the thing about agriculture is that because it's a land use issue as well, as we'll see later in my talk, This is the biggest driver of biodiversity loss, and it is the biggest driver of water pollution. So much as people in the food business and agriculture sector don't want to talk about it, literally we can't deal with this issue unless we talk fundamentally about our food system. And talk about our food system as well as much more than just agriculture. For instance, our food system includes the fishing that goes on at sea, which has wreaked absolute havoc in ocean ecosystems and is also contributing to greenhouse gases. Now, on the one hand, uh, the issue of global heating is easy to understand. You burn greenhouse gases, it changes the chemistry of the atmosphere, and physics does the rest. We can measure greenhouse gas emissions quite easily. That means that the way the system has progressed, that each country has its targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. These can be reported on and measured quite accurately. And that makes it, in one way, an easy issue to understand, even if it's not an easy issue to address. Biodiversity is completely different. Biodiversity is what's referred to as a complex system. It's full of moving parts. We don't even know how many species there are in the world, never mind uh, identifying them all and trying to figure out what their role is. And all these species are interacting with each other. They're interacting with the non-living elements of the earth, like the air and the water and the soil and so on. And so biodiversity is really, really difficult to measure. You can't just stick a meter into the air or the water and get a biodiversity reading, although there are developments in eDNA and so on. But if I want to know how many hen harriers there are in Ireland, uh, this means I have to send a team of surveyors, of highly trained people, out into the field over a season to gather this information. And by the time it's published, it's already out of date. So, and that's just, let's say, for one species. So biodiversity is inherently complex, very difficult to measure. And so it didn't lend itself to the kind of headline target that we see under the Paris Agreement about 1.5 degrees. So we did have a similar agreement in Montreal a couple of years ago. We have a global agreement on biodiversity, but it lacks that kind of headline parameter about what we should be aiming for, because it's all very specific to location and to other factors. So that's the main difference. Now, the thing about it is, though, that biodiversity has followed quite a dramatic trajectory in recent years, despite the fact that it's difficult to measure. We have this thing called the Living Planet Index, and that is from the World Wildlife Fund and the Zoological Society of London, which have been measuring the populations of vertebrates. So we talk about vertebrates, we're talking about land mammals, fish, birds, amphibians. That's pretty much it. We're not looking at insects and so on. Uh, and they have been monitoring the populations of vertebrates since 1970. And 1970 is just over 50 years ago, just a little bit longer than my lifetime. It's not exactly that the world was in a pristine condition in 1970. I mean, damage has been going on for many thousands of years. But even in the last 50 years, the populations in aggregate of animals has declined by about 3/4, which is absolutely shocking. And when we look at other figures, we see that basically what we've done over this time is replace wild animals with farm animals and humans and our pets. And that's a very poor substitute for biodiversity that has evolved over millions of years. Now, I'm going to talk about Ireland for the rest of this talk. And when I started giving talks on this stuff, when I published my book in 2017, this question might have seemed a bit strange. What do you mean, where is nature gone? Isn't Ireland green and wonderful? And we're told it's origin green, and we're told it's the wild Atlantic way. I mean, isn't all of this greenery fantastically nature friendly. I think th that has changed somewhat in recent years. We've had citizens' assemblies. We have had some kind of an awakening to the fact that Ireland has basically been denuded of nature, and ecosystems in Ireland have collapsed. And by any definition of that term, there is no such thing as a functioning, healthy ecosystem in Ireland. And so we do have to ask ourselves the question, where did it go? Now, the picture here was a field. I mean, it could be anywhere in Ireland, and we have fields like this all over the place. And but the fact is that prior to agriculture, this field would have been dense forest, would have been dense deciduous forest, what's sometimes called Atlantic rainforest, maybe. Um, but we know from archaeological evidence, from pollen records, and so on, that about 80% of Ireland was forest. And that reached a maximum at maybe about 7 or 8 thousand years ago. And then once farming came in, it started with the clearance of the forests. And today we have, I think, 1%. We don't even have an accurate figure for this, but it could be around 1% of the country is native forest, which is pitiful. It is, of countries that are basically not desert, Ireland is surely one of the most deforested countries in the world. Uh, but when agriculture moved in, the type of agriculture that was carried out in most fields in Ireland would have been what we would refer to today as pretty nature friendly. There were no chemicals being used. Nutrients were still in very short supply, so there was no pollution of rivers or anything like that. Uh, the fields themselves would have been full of different types of plants and grasses, not just one type of grass that we see today, but a huge diversity. Now, the farmers themselves would have called them weeds and may not have welcomed them, but that diversity in plant life was very good for the soil. It was also very good for insects, particularly pollinating insects, to have lots of flowers. And we would have even had a lot of ground nesting birds right up to 100 years ago. A typical field in Ireland like this would have had maybe curlews, corncrakes, partridges, skylarks, lapwing, all kinds of birds that have adapted to nest on the ground. And particularly since the 1970s, I would say, although there's signs that it started before that, but particularly since the 70s, joining the European Union, entering the Common Agricultural Policy, the proliferation of cheap fertilizer, cheap chemicals, bigger machinery. What we have today is green monoculture grasslands, virtually no ground nesting birds. They're all threatened with extinction, or really like down to they're a couple of dozen pairs. Pollinators in total collapse. Two-thirds of our bees are threatened with extinction. Uh, and no plant diversity in fields like this. You might get dandelions, docks, things like that, but there's sprays even for those things. So we have completely simplified the main agricultural environment. And of course, if you're putting fertilizers on this, whether that's dung or slurry or artificial fertilizers, you're talking about releases of greenhouse gases, releases of ammonia, which is a threat to human health, and an awful lot of the nutrients is wasted. It isn't taken up by the plants. It ends up in rivers and groundwater where it pollutes the rivers. It accumulates in estuaries. So about a third of our estuaries are polluted from the concentrating effects of agricultural runoff and other sources of nutrients. And that is pretty much what happened to nature in Ireland to this day. I mean, it is still continuing, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So, I mean, that kind of lowland agriculture covers about 60% of Ireland. About 20% of Ireland is upland. This is a view of the Wicklow uplands from around the Sally Gap. And many of us were just reared to think that, these places were wild, but I mean, they're wild insofar as the weather is dreadful, but from a biodiversity perspective, these places have been absolutely destroyed and denuded of wildlife just as much as the lowlands. People have been up here for years. People were farming in upland areas. I mean, there still are, but there was an awful lot more people farming in these areas with cattle up until the 1800s. There was turf cutting going on. What we've seen in recent decades is fires, so that in order to maintain the vegetation for sheep grazing, the whole landscape has been set on fire repeatedly, and this simplifies the vegetation so that even if you're a child in the 80s, you'd be driving around the uplands, and in the summertime, they'd all be purple with the heather. And nowadays, they're just mostly brown, or sometimes they're green for a brief period in the summer because the heather is nearly extinct as well. And much of these areas are just swathes of grass. Ground nesting birds are gone here as well. And of course, we have a lot of deer now that are eating everything. And one of the interesting things is that if you go back to 1600s, 1700s, from pollen records, you will find that this area was also quite forested. There was birch forest, oak, ash, different species, maybe quite a different type of forest, maybe more open than what you would have found in the more sheltered lowlands, but still a pretty forested landscape, maybe with open bogs as well. But these habitats now are in very poor condition. And of course, releasing greenhouse gases. If you've got very peat-rich habitat, which is what these are, and the peat is degraded, then we're talking about the release of greenhouse gases. And also, by the way, this is particularly this area is the source of water for Dublin. And yet, I don't see Uisce Éireann making any kind of connection to the natural infrastructure that produces our water and the physical infrastructure that they're struggling to maintain to keep water clean. We had a big, I think it might have been 2018, 2019, we had a major failure at the leak slip wastewater treatment plant, sorry, water treatment plant. And hundreds of thousands of people had no drinking water in Dublin. We had to boil our water. Um, and this is because of pollution and all kinds of other things getting into the water. Yet this kind of landscape will do it for free if it was in a healthy condition. Now, coming down from the uplands, Ireland is a wet country, and most of the rain that falls obviously ends up in our rivers. But our rivers are not. Well, we learned in school how rivers come from the hills and then they get into the lowlands and they slow down and they meander and they flood, and we have oxbow lakes. I don't know if anybody is old enough to remember being taught about oxbow lakes when we were kids learning geography. And then it was only much later that I scratched my head going, why did we learn about oxbow lakes? We don't have any. Certainly we used to, but the extent of land drainage in Ireland has been such that rivers have bear no resemblance to natural functioning ecosystems that rivers should look like. This is the River Boyne in County Meath. It's a special area of conservation. You can see that virtually every tree and shrub has been stripped from its banks. Trees and woody material are really, really important in rivers. They provide shelter for fish and shade and all kinds of things. Um, and mainly what has happened here is that the river has been drained and dredged by the Office of Public Works since under the Arterial Drainage Act. And the purpose of this was to create more farmland. And so, in a way, it's quite effective. You can see the farmland on either side is high and dry. The river itself is not dead, but it's in very poor condition. And of course, doing this means that when you have high levels of rainfall, the water, instead of spreading out onto the fields and slowing down, it basically picks up speed, rushes down, and floods the next town along the way. And this is a major problem that we're grappling with at the moment. Um, I was reading about Listowel in County Kerry last night and the flooding that's going on there. And, this is going to be a major problem over the coming decades with enhanced um, extreme weather. Now, we also have our bogs, and This is, I mean, Ireland was home to one of the highest proportions of what's called raised bog anywhere in the world, and particularly in Europe. Um, and for years, the bogs were seen as a problem. They were very inaccessible, they were wet, difficult to access. And it was only really when the machinery became available after the Second World War that we started really exploiting the bogs, and we did it with gusto. And it wasn't. I mean, there were huge attempts before that to drain bogs, but this really got the show on the road. And Bord another state agency, was charged with the industrial open pit strip mining of peatlands, particularly in the Midlands, because the peat is very deep and the land is quite flat and amenable to machinery. And so, I mean, the good news is that some of these areas well, Bord have stopped doing this for a start. And some areas are now in rehabilitation, but an awful lot of the bogs still look like this. And I mean, this is a total disaster environmentally. Not only is it a moonscape for any plant or animal that wants to live there, the amount of greenhouse gases coming off this is phenomenal. And you'll see the drains there. They're all leading into the local streams, leading onto the local rivers, bringing in sediment and dissolved oxygen, dissolved carbon, which are major pollutants. So this is a big problem. Now, the last big environment that we have in Ireland is the sea, and every time you go down to the beach, what you're looking at basically is identical all over the world. The color changes slightly, but it's very difficult to see what's happening under the ocean, and this is a big problem because I think if we could see it, we'd be completely appalled at the destruction that goes on. This is a photograph of the contents of a bottom trawling net, and it's from the Irish Sea. And bottom trawling basically is one of the most prevalent forms of fishing around the Irish coast, and indeed in Europe and in many parts of the world, because because it takes everything off the sea floor. It was seen as very productive. This particular net was catching prawns, and if you're very eagle-eyed, you'll see there are a few prawns in there. But they're taken out, and then the rest of the net is dumped overboard. And this is a huge problem with bottom trawling, the waste, the destruction. And we're also learning now about the greenhouse gas emissions that come from trawling, because the nets agitate sediment, resuspend sediment from the sea floor, and this results in the release of greenhouse gases. So bottom trawling is a huge problem. But there's all kinds of other types of fishing as well that have basically hollowed out the ocean ecosystem. And all of this habitat destruction has led to a wave of extinction in Ireland. And these are just some of the birds that have gone extinct. We don't really know just how many animals and plants have gone extinct in Ireland over the years, because a lot of the things would be small. And even today, it takes specialist surveyors to go out and find a rare plant or a rare insect. There are very few people who can do this kind of stuff. But the big things were noticeable, and we have records going back about all the pretty big and impressive animals that lived in Ireland, including wolves and bears, lynx, um, wild boar, and some of these really impressive birds. Now, some of them have come back. The crane has come back. It is breeding now on bogs in the Midlands, and that's very welcome. The osprey has also come back. There's talk about bringing the goshawk back. Amazingly, the North Atlantic right whale, which was hunted from whaling stations in Mayo and Donegal at the turn of the 20th century, is functionally completely extinct from this side of the Atlantic Ocean. There's only a few hundred left now on the coast of the US and Canada. But amazingly, last year there was a sighting of a North Atlantic right whale off the coast of Donegal. This is the first time uh, in over 100 years that we've had such a sighting. And despite all the pressure, it is amazing to see that these things happen, that nature has such amazing force to it, that if we just took our foot off its neck, it will recuperate and it will bounce back. But not only have we had, a lot of things go extinct, we've also gone in my lifetime from many species being really abundant and widespread to being threatened with extinction. And these are a few. The salmon and the eel, you might know. Some of them are not so well known, like the purple sea urchin or the angel shark. But we know from assessments that have been carried out that about a third of all the species that have been assessed are threatened with extinction or near threatened with extinction. So this is a massive decline in not just diversity but abundance of wildlife in the last 40 to 50 years in Ireland. Now that's all very depressing, and I usually tell people at this stage of my talk that if I haven't depressed you, then I haven't done my job properly, because it is depressing. And it's also really important because uh, uh, biodiversity is the foundation of our food system. It's where we get our water from. It's the air that we breathe. It's the places we go to. So hugely important for our health. And also, if we look from a policy perspective, um, we can't address the climate crisis without addressing the biodiversity crisis. Many of the habitats that I have spoken to you about, like bogs and forests and the ocean, are carbon rich, and we have depleted the carbon from them. So it's absolutely imperative that we restore these habitats in order to meet so many goals, really. But if we are to meet our environmental targets, biodiversity has to be absolutely central. This, I think, is recognized now in the Climate Act, and we have many policies and so on. I won't go into it, but our big issue, like in many issues in Ireland, is actual implementation of the things that we have said we will do. Now, I have a few minutes left, and I did promise I'd talk about rewilding because I put it in the title. And I believe that rewilding is such an antidote to all the terrible things that I've been speaking about in this talk, because rewilding is not only a scientific concept that can help us to bring back abundance and diversity and beauty, uh, and help us address our environmental problems. It's also an incredibly restorative and hopeful thing from a very human-centered point of view. And Lord knows, for anyone who takes the risks of, opening a newspaper these days, we need things that can give us a bit of hope and a bit of optimism that we can work together to solve our problems. And I think rewilding is that solution. And I mean, I have been following the debate about rewilding over the last 15 years. And basically, what we're trying to do with rewilding is restore natural ecosystems. Natural ecosystems not only do lots of things for people, but they're very self-sustaining. They have evolved over millions of years. Forests, coral reefs, wetlands, rivers, all of these things have been forming themselves and can do that again if we give them the time and the space and if they have all the species there. So rewilding is about trying to kickstart natural processes. And it's very similar to nature restoration. You might have heard about the nature restoration law. I won't get into the differences, but there's an awful lot of overlap. We're basically talking about largely the same thing. And rewilding has been criticized. I mean, I have found there was an initial wave of enthusiasm for it, even here in Ireland, and then a lot of people went cold on it. Uh, it was seen as being anti-farming, anti-farmers. It was seen as being anti-rural, and all these conspiracy theories sprung up around the idea of rewilding. But at the same time, it is happening, and it is quite taken off across Europe in particular. Um, and there are many countries that are doing rewilding at very large scale, and if you can see some of the projects that are underway, it's really quite remarkable. I think some of the The risks, certainly from my point of view and the work that I've been doing over the last number of years, you're constantly looking at the government, you're looking at ministers to try and make decisions and to get on with things. And that can be a bit of a pitfall because governments are so slow to do anything. And even sometimes when they say they'll do something, they don't actually do it. So it's an incredibly frustrating area to be in. And on the other hand, it's incredibly um, hopeful to see the work that is being done by community groups, by private landowners, big and small, by NGOs across Europe who are really doing the heavy lifting. I've just put at the top of the screen on the right, you'll see the IUCN. The IUCN is the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. And they have a rewilding working group. And so I put that there because one of the things I've heard a lot is that rewilding doesn't mean anything. Now, granted, you can go into Boots and buy stuff for rewilding your skin. And obviously, this is not what we're talking about. So it has been, kind of commandeered by the marketing department for lots of things. But but rewilding is fundamentally a scientific concept. It's about, as I described, it's about getting nature and natural systems back up and running, and it has been accepted by the international scientific community. And so, my hope, and I leave it on this, is that we embrace rewilding from a landscape point of view, and fund it and give landowners proper incentives to do it, because the actual doing of it is not technically difficult. It's not hard. But where we have found the main logjam is in the economics of it. Basically, most farmers struggle to earn a living. We can't ask them to rewild their land if we're not, giving them a viable proposition in which to do that. And there's a lot of work being done on how we can get about that. But as I say, the level of the rate of progress is so depressingly slow. And of course, now we have right-wing actors who are trying to undo even the few advances that we have made in recent years. So it does feel like things are under an awful lot of pressure at the moment. But thank you for listening. I just included this drawing at the end. It comes from my podcast, if you want to check that out. It was really just trying to visualize what Ireland might look like in a rewilded world. We're not trying to rewild all of the country. I would never suggest we have to rewild everything. I would love to get to a position where we're rewilding maybe 30–40% of the country. The rest of it can still be used for food production. We can still have animal agriculture. We just need to shrink it and diversify it. And I think that is a way to promote a system that is not only nature friendly, but is also very good socially and economically for people who are working and living in these areas. So thanks very much, Mark. I think I've
Thanks.
time
Thanks a
for
million,
questions.
Pork. If you want to get a glass of water there, I'll ramble on for a minute so you can take a breather. And if anyone wants to put their questions in the chat, I'm going to start off with a couple from myself. One would be the technicalities of rewilding, I suppose. And I think part of maybe some of the controversy was that rewilding means different things to different people. And, some people would call rewilding bringing back woolly mammoths and this kind of thing. And that, there can be kind of misunderstandings. But if we keep it at reinstating natural processes, like in some places, if the place is not too badly degraded and there's a lot of source material, that's quite easy to do, I suppose. But in other areas, if you do nothing, you may end up with a whole host of invasive species, for example. And maybe there's a lot of management required there. So the question really is it a case of do nothing, or is there a certain amount of management that you would expect with any rewilding project that will vary depending on the place and what state it's in?
Yeah, so I mean that's an important question, and I think it has been interpreted in a lot of cases as doing nothing. Um, in some areas, doing nothing has been very successful. I mean, the reason why many European countries today have very high levels of forest is because of land abandonment in the 19th century. And because there were still pockets of wolves and beavers and all these other animals, that the ecosystem managed to reknit itself. Now, I've never, land abandonment is a negative thing. But the facts are there. In Ireland, doing nothing on any given piece of land, it's really a coin flip as to whether you get a good outcome from it or not. Um, as you pointed out, Ireland has a very high deer population. We have invasive plant species like rhododendron, cherry laurel, all these other things. So I would say, at least in half cases, maybe more, we're talking about management. Things like restoring rivers, getting rivers back, connecting them with their floodplains will not happen naturally just by doing nothing. We'll have to bring in machines and reprofile those rivers. A bit like what has been happening on some of the bogs where Bord na Móna have a program of what they term enhanced restoration. I would call it rewilding, because basically what they're doing is they are reprofiling the surface of these bogs to hold on to water. They're basically restoring the hydrological processes. And after that, nature is just going to be allowed to take its own course. And if cranes come and nest on them, great, and so on. So, I mean, there's definitely management monitoring. It's not about doing nothing, but we also know that when the conditions are right, we want to be moving towards a, a state where we're doing nothing. We want to be moving towards conditions whereby nature can pretty much look after itself. And we know also that there are so many missing species in Ireland that that's probably a while off, but that would be the direction of effort.
Thanks very much. So in most cases, it's not a do nothing scenario. There is purposeful and ongoing management involved. Now, my second question, and then I will open it to everyone else, is in urban areas. I suppose a lot of our younger, our profession generally, most of our work would be in urban areas, and uh, a lot of our younger members in particular would like to see more nature in urban areas where they live and work. So I know you work as a project ecologist as well on development, so you know the kind of design teams that we're talking about and that we work on. So the question is, do you see much room for rewilding in urban areas and urban developments?
Yeah, I do. Now, I may step back from calling it rewilding in urban areas, because natural processes, well, I mean, okay, we'll park that maybe for the moment, but definitely there's room for an awful lot more nature in our cities. Um, we have a lot of green space in Dublin, but I mean, a lot of it is very boring and disheartening to look at. It's just vast expanses of green. Where I live during the summer, I mean, I see these enormous tractors going up and down every fortnight to make sure that the grass is kept at a certain height. So, I mean, obviously, we need to have areas that are for amenity and picnics and playing football, but there's a huge opportunity, I think, um, to have more wild spaces in our cities. I was writing recently about the Phoenix Park, and I live near the Phoenix Park, but also I kind of hone in on the park because it's such a high profile green space, and I think that it could be an inspiration to green spaces in other cities and towns. And what I see in the park is that it's just it's managed in order to keep it in a certain way, like a pickle in a jar of vinegar, and there seems to be reluctance to see it in any other way. And particularly, I was critical of the deer, because the deer, a bit like the rest of the country, there's just too many deer. and the deer have everything eaten out of it. So I would definitely think that there's room for rewilding. The other thing I noticed, and I mean, if people are interested more, I did a chapter in my podcast specifically about this issue in urban areas. I mean, you don't. It's very easy to see if you go to Balls Bridge, Rathgar. These areas are not called leafy suburbs for nothing. And then if you go to Cabra and maybe less advantaged areas, there's an absolute stark difference between the level of tree cover across the social divide in Dublin that I think should be addressed. But the bottom line to your question is there's huge opportunity, I think, in cities for nature recovery.
Great, thanks. So, give a question now from Lei Ching, which thank you so much for the talk. Could you talk more about successful rewilding strategies in Ireland and perspectives to enhance agriculture and ecology? So, I think that's examples of successful projects that you know of.
Yeah, so I mean, I would point to the work that Board Namona has been doing on the bogs, where the main reason they've been doing it is for carbon and to reduce the release of carbon from degraded peatlands. But to me, it's a great rewilding program, and they could be doing an awful lot more of it. Um, I mean, in terms of other areas, the government is not promoting rewilding. It's not putting the effort behind it, despite how it could really help to deliver our environmental targets. And specifically, I could think about forestry. We have to, because we have emissions coming from our land use sector, we have to greatly increase the level of forestry in Ireland, just from a carbon accounting perspective. Now, one of the quickest and easiest ways of doing that would be through rewilding, through allowing, where possible, trees to seed themselves. So basically, if you can control the grazing, whether that's deer or sheep or whatever, you will get trees planting themselves. This is what forests have been doing for millions of years. Other countries have done it. I'm thinking in particular Costa Rica, Nepal has done it. And you can do it in the space of decades, like 20, 30 years. You're not going to get ancient forests, obviously, after 30 years, but you will get substantial rewilding of actual forests that are functionally coherent through rewilding. Unfortunately, there's an awful lot of resistance to the idea within the government, and basically because I think the reason was no, it kind of goes against our culture. We feel that tr if you want a forest, you need to go out and plant trees. You need a shovel and a nursery and plastic tubes. And we kind of are very reluctant to accept that nature has been doing this for a lot longer than we have and is a lot better at it. And I think a lot of people felt threatened by this idea, and therefore it wasn't included. Now, at the moment, we're not meeting the forest strategy we have at the moment is not making anybody happy. So we're not meeting our targets. So there's still pressure to do something about it. I would hope that, although the current government mightn't give me much hope, but I would hope that there will be a realization that if we want to meet these targets, we're going to have to embrace rewilding to do it.
Thanks. Aldona is commenting that she misses forests since she moved to Ireland, which I think is another dimension, is the cultural and our biological affinity to trees, and there's more and more research coming out on the well-being that trees provide. But Shane then is asking the nature restoration law. How do you feel about the the national government's response to how we might implement it, confining it to Quilcha and Bord na Móna national parks?
Well, I mean, I think if anyone followed the almighty battle over the nature restoration law, I think it is a very positive thing that we have a nature restoration law. It's positive that the governments have put money into it. There's going to be a nature fund coming into being next year. I think that's very positive. There's currently work on developing the plan. Obviously, we have to wait and see what that looks like. All of this comes down to the implementation. I think, to be honest, the farming organizations shot themselves in the foot to a certain extent by forcing the government to commit to doing all the work, certainly up to 2030, on public land. Because that means that funding streams from the government are going to go straight back into the government, and farmers won't get any of it. So I think that was unfortunate. I do think that if there was a fund set up for farmers, particularly to provide them with income streams, not necessarily just one-off payments, but income streams, a bit like what the Common Agricultural Policy does at the moment for nature restoration, then this is where we would start seeing, big movement on stuff. But ultimately, the targets for the nature restoration law out to 2040 and 2050 can't be met on public land alone. There just simply isn't enough public land in Ireland to do it.
Thanks. Marianne, I see you have your camera on if you want to unmute and ask your question yourself.
Hi, thanks, Mark. Yeah, sure. I just was thinking, could you give any thoughts to us on how to approach this from a landscape scale? Thanks for the presentation, by the way, it was really good. But I'm just, we get into these individual projects, which are really useful as case studies, but given the urgency of the situation and the need for change to happen, and it takes so long sometimes to get some progress on certain habitats. Just wondering what your thoughts are. Like your story with the image of the uplands and a particular hill or mountain, the story of that hill or mountain, was very thought-provoking about how it used to be in the 80s this and now it's this. But how would you attack the mountain as opposed to the individual bog?
Well, I mean, I would look at what is being done in other European countries, Marianne, and particularly I've been very inspired by Rewilding Europe. And if those of you who don't know, Rewilding Europe is an organization based in the Netherlands, but they work in landscapes across Europe. And there was a research paper that was published last year, peer-reviewed, looking at Rewilding Europe compared to government approaches to nature restoration. And they found that Rewilding Europe was more successful because they are working at a landscape level. They can see, and I think in Ireland, I think the most logical unit to look at is the hydrological catchment. You look at the river because the water ties everything together. You work with people who are willing to work with you. You don't get into battles with people who really don't like you and don't like what you're talking about. You work with people, you build up trust on the ground, and you build it up from that way. I think Rewilding Europe have done incredible work across the continent, often with hostile governments and hostile farm organizations and all of that. So, I mean, if I would love to see that happen in Ireland. There was some talk about if this famous land use strategy that I mean, who knows when or that's going to appear or what it's going to look like. But I mean, my sense from reading it was that we would be looking at it at a hydrological catchment level and deciding, well, what are the kind of land uses that are suitable here? We have to be careful. We don't want to be coloring in people's land to say that this is what we want here. We've done that before and it was a disaster and it just leads to social conflict. So we have to, I think, look at this from a social aspect as well as the ecology part of it. The ecology is easy, as you know, Marianne. It's dealing with people, dealing with the economics of it and all. That's the hard part. But definitely, if you're looking for inspiration, and there's examples from Britain as well. There's the Rewilding Britain have a lot of stuff going on. But this is happening. It's being done, and it's being done successfully. That I think we should be replicating here.
Thanks, Pádraic. I need to let you go soon, but I'm going to squeeze one more question in if you don't mind. Sorry to anyone whose questions didn't get asked. I'm hopeful that Pádraic has already answered them in his answers. But Maria has a question there. do you think more planning authorities should push for a green factor, such as South Dublin County Council, to control landscape quantities in urban developments? And would you see that taking a step further nationwide? And do you see biodiversity net gain taking a part in rewilding?
You'll have to explain to me what a green factor
So it's I suppose a version of biodiversity net gain. So the planning authority in South Dublin County Council, if you seek planning permission, then you have to reach a certain number in terms of what you're offering in terms of green space. So one of the good things I like about it is if you have pre-existing valuable habitat, you get a very good score for that. So it's to in that case, it's to try and get around where developers might clear their site to make sure they have nothing to protect before they start looking to develop it. So it encourages you, if you have that kind of habitat, you get to the score you need to get quicker. But then it encourages the likes of green roofs or tree planting in the planning of your development in order to get up to that number, or retention of hedgerows. All these things will help you get that score.
That sounds very I've got to look into that. I mean, I have been following the debate in England, where biodiversity net gain now is up and running for over a year. I mean, I'm open-minded about it. I can see the pitfalls in it. I can see why it's a good thing to be getting public private money into nature restoration. I'm not against that at all. I think we have to be a bit skeptical because of how it has been done in a carbon context over the last 10 years with carbon credits and all that kind of stuff. That have been pretty much worthless. I mean, I'm in favor of it if it works, is the bottom line. I think it's too early yet to see whether BNG is working in England. But I'm open-minded about it.
Yeah, I might point out to everyone that there's an Irish Landscape Institute webinar that should be available on YouTube on South Dublin County Council's green factor for anyone who wants to find out more about that. But for today, Pádraic, thanks a million for taking the time, and I think it's very much a case of don't shoot the messenger. You've delivered us a lot of, I suppose, bad information. Well, very factual information, I should say. Good information that's very hard to listen to, I think. Yeah, and I can highly recommend Pádraic's book as well, Whittled Away, if you want to go even deeper into the biodiversity loss over the last couple of 100 years. There's some excellent data there. I know if you're of a certain age, you probably don't need to read about it, you've seen it, but for anyone who wants to see just how far we've plummeted, and there's some examples of successful turnarounds as well. Definitely seek out Pádraic's book. So thanks a million, Pádraic, and we'll see you all again for the next Irish Landscape Institute webinar.
Great. Okay, Mark, thank you very much. Bye, everybody.